In the dark, a hand finds a bruise without meaning to. It presses down, just to check if it still hurts. Most nights, it does. Somewhere tonight, your body has already settled into the shape it knows best. The shoulder that always turns first. The leg that finds the cool edge of the sheet. The room is quiet in the particular way. A room becomes quiet only after midnight, when the house itself seems to be listening. You already know what it feels like to be hurt once, and then to keep hurting yourself with the same wound. Hours later, for no reason the hurt can explain. You are not doing anything wrong by noticing that tonight. Most people never do. So let the shoulders release into the mattress. Let the jaw unclench from whatever it has been holding since this morning. And let this be the 1 hour where nothing needs defending. Just listen. I want to tell you something honest before we begin. I have spent a long time with old teachers who never once raised their voice, and I have noticed that the ones who suffered least were not the ones who avoided pain. They were the ones who stopped adding to it. That difference took me years to understand, and I am still not finished understanding it. Tonight, we will walk through 11 small lives: a stonecutter, a boatwoman, a potter, a widow named Patakara, whose grief was written down by her own hand centuries ago, and a handful of Zen teachers who answered their students with almost nothing at all. Each one carries a piece of the same quiet teaching that the first pain is rarely the one that keeps us awake. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. There is nothing to solve tonight. No lesson to hold on to by morning. No insight to remember and repeat. Just let your hands go still, wherever they are resting. Let the bruise, whatever it is, go unchecked for once. We will sit beside it together, gently, until you are already asleep and no longer need me to. The night settles the way it always does after the first true stillness, not all at once, but in small surrenders. A held breath finally let go, a weight shifting from one hip to the other, and somewhere in that shifting, a hand finds a place on the body that still remembers the day. Perhaps it is not even a real hurt anymore. Perhaps it is only the memory of one, kept alive by the same small motion that first noticed it press. Check. Wince. Press again. As if the body could interrogate the pain into leaving. As if noticing it hard enough were a kind of cure. Most of us have done this without knowing we were doing it. We have held a sore muscle, the way we hold a grudge, turning it over, testing its edges, keeping it warm so it never quite heals. And underneath that habit is a very old, very human belief that if we resist something hard enough, for long enough, it will finally give up and leave us alone. The Buddha taught that there are 2 arrows. The first is the pain itself, sudden, real, and mostly beyond our choosing. The second is the resistance we add to it afterward, the tightening around the wound that was never part of the wound at all. Long ago, in the hill country above a great river, in a town that lived and breathed by the sound of hammers on stone, a man named Wei learned the difference between the two the hard way. The quarry announced itself, before it was ever seen, first the dry, mineral smell carried on the wind, then the flat ringing of metal on rock echoing off the hillside, and closer still, the fine grey dust that settled on everything, on eyelashes and sleeves and the backs of hands. until every worker in the valley looked faintly the same color as the stone they cut. Wei had been a stone cutter for 20-some years, and for the last several of them, his lower back had carried a pain that never fully left. Some mornings, it was a dull weight behind his hip. Some mornings, it locked him in place before he had even stood from his mat. He had stopped mentioning it to anyone. Mentioning it felt like losing. So instead, Wei fought it. Every morning he rose faster than the pain expected, moved through it before it could settle in, swung his hammer with more force than the stone required, as though enough force might finally silence the thing that lived in his spine. He told himself this was discipline. His younger apprentice, watching from across the pit, was starting to wonder if it was something else. The unraveling began on an ordinary afternoon, hotter than most, when Wei's hammer glanced wrong off a block of limestone, and the pain in his back rose so sharply that he had to set both hands against the rock just to stay upright. He did not cry out. He had trained himself long ago never to cry out. But an old woman who sold water at the edge of the quarry, who had watched him work every season for years, set down her ladle and came to stand beside him. "You fight it like it owes you something," she said. Wei straightened, too quickly, and regretted it. "It does. It's taken half my strength this year." "Has it?" the woman said. "Not quite a question. Or have you spent half your strength making sure it knows you haven't surrendered?" He didn't answer. She crouched, unbothered by his silence, and picked up a fallen chip of stone from the dust. "Watch the river some evening," she said. "Not the stones in the middle, the ones that fight the current head-on. Watch the ones near the bank, the ones the water simply moves around. They wear down slower. They last." "The current doesn't stop for either of them," Wei said. "No," she agreed. "But one of them spends its whole life braced. The other only feels the water passing." Wei looked down at his own hand, still pressed flat against his lower back, without his having noticed it get there. He had been bracing, not just today, for years. Every hammer swing thrown a little too hard, every morning risen a little too fast, all of it aimed not at the stone, but at the pain itself, as if enough effort could out-argue a body. He did not tell the water seller she was wrong. He also did not thank her, not in words. He simply sat down on the nearest block of unfinished stone, for the first time in longer than he could remember, and let his back curve into whatever shape it actually wanted to hold. The pain did not leave, but for a moment, nothing was fighting it. By the time he returned to work that evening, something in the rhythm of his swing had changed, not weaker, but less clenched. The force of the blow no longer carrying the extra charge of a man proving a point to his own spine. The pain traveled with him the rest of that season, as it likely would for the rest of his life. But it traveled alone now, without the second weight. He had been adding to it every single day without noticing. And perhaps that is the harder truth to sit with tonight. Not that the ache in your shoulders or the tightness behind your eyes will simply vanish because you have decided to stop minding it, but that so much of what exhausts us is not the ache itself. It is the arguing. The mind has its own version of Wei's hammer, swung a little too hard, a little too often, against whatever hurts. This shouldn't still be bothering me. I should be over this by now. Why can't I just let it go? Each of those thoughts feels like effort spent healing. Most of them are only the second arrow, dressed up as discipline. What was Wei actually holding on to? Underneath the bracing, not the pain, the belief that surrender to it would mean losing something. That resting his back meant admitting defeat, when in fact, the opposite was true. The resting was the only strength that had ever really mattered. You have likely done this too, in smaller ways. Replayed an old ache in the body or the heart, tightened around it, checked whether it was still there, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. Not because checking helps, because stopping felt, somehow, like giving up. The water only feels the current once. Let that be enough for now. Some pain is simply present tonight. In the shoulders, in the jaw, in a place further in than either, and it does not need your argument to be real. It only needs you to stop bracing against it long enough to feel what is actually here. Once, without the second telling. Not every kind of bracing looks like a hammer swung too hard. Some of it looks like tending someone else's pain instead of your own, and mistaking worry for care. In a small mountain temple in old Japan, during a long, wet spring when the rains would not stop and the paper screens stayed damp for weeks, a young monk named Ryo was given the task of caring for his teacher, an old man whose lungs had begun to fail him with the season. "Master," Ryo said one evening, kneeling beside the old man's mat with a bowl of warm water and a cloth, "your breathing sounds worse tonight than yesterday." "Does it?" the old master said, eyes closed, unbothered. "Should I fetch the physician again? Should I open the screen? Or close it? I don't know which is right." Ryo's hands had gone still over the bowl, caught between one action and another, terrified of choosing wrong. The old man opened his eyes at that, and there was no urgency in them at all. "Are you? My lungs are doing exactly what lungs my age do in a wet spring. That is the whole of it. Nothing more is happening than that. But you might not recover from this one." "I might not," the master agreed simply. "Neither will you. Someday, from something that has always been true. It only feels new to you tonight because you are standing this close to it." Ryo sat with that, the cloth going cool and forgotten in his hands. "Then what am I supposed to do? Just watch you struggle?" "You are watching an old man breathe," the master said. "That is not the same as watching him struggle. The struggling is the part you are adding, out of love, because it is unbearable to you to simply witness something you cannot fix. Set the bowl down a moment. Sit. Breathe with me instead of for me." Ryo set the bowl down. For a long while, neither of them spoke, and the sound in the room was only the old man's uneven breath, and, beneath it, the rain finding its way along the eaves outside. Steady, indifferent, going nowhere in particular. By the time the rain finally eased near dawn, Ryo had not fixed anything, but he had stopped adding his own fear to his teacher's breath, and in the quiet that followed. That difference was the only medicine either of them still needed that night. Wei learned to stop bracing against his own body. Ryo learned to stop bracing on someone else's behalf. Different pain. Same second arrow. The belief that vigilance is love. That resistance is strength. That if we only hold on tightly enough, the holding itself will keep the worst from happening. It rarely does. Mostly it just adds a second ache to the first. A second sleepless hour to the one that was already hard enough. A second worry laid on top of a fear that was already doing its own work without our help. You are watching. That is not the same as struggling. Somewhere tonight, you may be doing what Wei did, or what Ryo almost did, bracing against something that has already happened, or something that has not happened yet, as if the bracing were protection rather than simply more weight. It rarely protects anyone. It only tires the one doing the bracing. There is a version of tonight where you set the bowl down, the way Ryo did, where you let your spine curve the way it actually wants to, the way Wei finally allowed his to. Not fixing, not solving, just present with what is here. Once, without the second telling. Let your hands unclench now, wherever they are resting. Let your jaw soften, and your shoulders find the mattress without checking first whether it is safe to. Somewhere in your body, there may be a small ache that has been asking for your attention for longer than you realized, not asking you to solve it, only asking you to stop fighting it long enough to let it be exactly as tired as it already is. Breathe in and feel the weight of the whole day resting against the bed beneath you. Breathe out and let that be the only work left to do tonight, not holding on, not bracing, only breathing. And beneath the breath, a stillness that was always waiting for the fighting to stop. And somewhere close to sleep, there is another kind of ache, not in the body this time, but older, quieter, the kind that comes from carrying a feeling long after the moment that caused it has passed. That one is waiting for you next. And perhaps, somewhere in that stillness, Ryo finally found beside his teacher, another kind of weight has already begun to make itself known. Not sharp, not sudden, just the low, familiar heaviness of a body that has given more of itself today than it had left to give. You know this tiredness, not the kind that follows a hard climb, the kind that earns its rest honestly and wears its ache like a quiet medal. This is the other kind, the tiredness that arrives uninvited near the end of an ordinary day, and then, instead of being allowed to simply exist, gets met with a second feeling stacked on top of it. A flicker of frustration at your own slowness. A quiet accusation, aimed at no one but yourself, for not having more left to give by now. As if being tired were a failure of character, rather than a plain fact of a body that has been working since before the sun came up. The Buddha taught that suffering rarely arrives alone. It is joined, almost immediately, by our resistance to it. And nowhere is that resistance quieter or more exhausting than in the anger we sometimes feel toward our own exhaustion. Long ago, on a wide brown river in old Japan, a woman who spent her whole life ferrying others across the water discovered this on an evening no different from 1,000 before it. The river announced the end of the day before the sky did. First came the smell of it, cool and green and faintly of fish, rising off the water as the afternoon heat finally lifted. Then the patient creak of wet rope against the mooring post, steady as a heartbeat that had learned not to hurry. And beneath her bare feet, the worn grain of the boat's floorboards, softened by decades of crossings into something almost like skin. Her name was Sata, and she had rowed this crossing since she was a girl young enough to need both hands wrapped around a single oar just to move it through the water. By evening, after more crossings than she had bothered counting, Her arms had gone past, aching into something closer to absence. A dull refusal in the muscle that no longer answered quickly when she asked it to pull. Her shoulders carried the particular heaviness that comes only from hours of repeated motion. The kind of tired that settles into the bone. One more crossing waited on the far bank. A farmer, an old woman, and a boy stood at the water's edge in the last orange light, watching for her boat the way people always watched, with the plain, unquestioning certainty that she would come, because she always came, because that was simply what Sata did, evening after evening, season after season, for as long as any of them could remember. Sata pushed off anyway. She always pushed off anyway. That was not the part that troubled her. What troubled her, halfway across the river, was the way her stroke began to falter, the oar catching wrong against the current, her grip slipping half an inch before correcting itself. Small failures that would have meant nothing on a fresh morning but felt, tonight, like evidence. And rising up inside her, uninvited, was something that had nothing to do with the river at all. A hot, private anger, not at the farmer waiting patiently on the bank, not at the current, which was only doing what current always does, at herself, for being this slow tonight, this spent, this unable to simply keep going, the way a woman who had rowed this river for 20 years was supposed to keep going, without ever once needing to stop and feel the size of her own tiredness. 20 years of this river, she thought, gripping the oar tighter than the stroke required. And tonight my arms belong to someone weaker than I am. She said nothing of this to her passengers. She never did. Her face had always been a still, closed thing on the water. The face of a woman who did her work and asked nothing of anyone watching her do it. But her jaw had tightened without her noticing, and her strokes had grown shorter and more forceful than the current actually called for, as though she could outrow her own exhaustion the way a person might out-argue an accusation leveled against them in the dark. The boat rocked harder than it needed to with each pull. Water slapped against the hull in small, uneven bursts. The old woman seated near the stern steadied herself against the rail with one thin hand and glanced, just once, toward Sata's face, though she said nothing yet. It was the boy who spoke first, no older than 9 or 10. Sitting near the bow with his knees drawn up to his chest and his chin resting on top of them, watching Sata the unguarded way only children watch adults, without pretending not to notice things. "Your arms are shaking," he said, not unkindly, just a fact, offered the way children offer facts, without weighing whether the moment wanted to hear it. "They're fine," Sata said, too quickly, the words leaving her mouth before she had decided to say them. "They don't look fine." Her oar caught the water at a poor angle on the next stroke and sent a small, ungraceful splash across the boy's knees. She felt her face go hot with something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite anger, but close kin to both. A feeling with no clean name. "I've rowed this river longer than you've been alive," she said, sharper than she meant to. "I know exactly what my own arms can and cannot do." The old woman on the bench beside the boy spoke then, quietly, without looking up from her folded hands resting in her lap. "No one on this boat is asking whether they can, child. He only asked whether they're tired." Sata's stroke faltered a second time, the oar dragging half a beat behind where it should have entered the water. And this time, she let it rest a moment across her knees. Dripping, the current pulling gently at the blade. "They are tired," she admitted, and hearing herself say the words out loud felt strange to her, almost illegal, as though tiredness were a secret she had spent years keeping even from herself. And speaking it now was a kind of small trespass against some rules she had never actually been told, but had followed anyway. "Then let them be tired," the old woman said, still not looking up, her voice carrying no judgment in either direction. "You are rowing this boat as though being tired was something you did wrong, as though it needed correcting, the way a bad knot needs correcting, or a crooked plank." Sarta looked down at her own hands, red and trembling faintly around the oar's worn wood. The wood itself, darker in the places her palms had gripped it for 20 years, and understood, all at once, that the old woman was right in a way that had very little to do with the river beneath them. She was not fighting the current tonight. The current was, as always, simply water moving toward the sea, indifferent to her arms or her pride. She was fighting the plain fact of her own limits, punishing her own muscles for the ordinary, unremarkable crime of having rowed since before dawn without complaint. She did not answer the old woman right away. There did not seem to be anything worth saying. She simply let the oar dip back into the water, slower now, without the extra force she had been throwing into every stroke since the anger first rose in her chest, somewhere near the middle of the crossing. The boat still moved forward. It moved, she noticed with something close to surprise, almost exactly as fast as it had before. The extra force she had been spending, stroke after furious stroke, had bought her nothing at all. It had only spent something she badly needed for the rest of the crossing still ahead of her, something she could not afford to waste on a fight that was never really about the river. By the time the bow finally touched the far bank, Sata's arms still ached, every bit as much as they had at the center of the river, perhaps more. But the second weight, the private, silent fury at her own tiredness, the argument she had been having with her own body for the better part of an hour, had quietly set itself down somewhere along the way, without her ever quite noticing the exact moment it happened. It was simply gone. The way a held breath is gone once it is finally released, leaving behind only the plain, honest ache of a body that had worked hard and was allowed, at last, to feel exactly how hard. The farmer stepped out first and helped his mother onto the shore, one hand steady beneath her elbow. The boy climbed out last, pausing at the edge of the boat, one foot still inside, to look back at Sarta over his shoulder. "Are your arms still tired?" he asked. And this time there was no teasing in it at all, only plain curiosity. "Yes," Sarta said, and for the first time all evening, something in her chest loosened as she said it. Some knot she had not known she was carrying until it began, slowly, to come undone. "Very tired." "That's all right," the boy said, with the plain, unguarded confidence that only children seem to carry into the world before anyone teaches them otherwise. "Everyone's arms get tired." Sarta watched the three of them make their way up the darkening bank toward the lantern light, already glowing faintly in the village windows, and she sat a moment longer alone in the boat before turning it back toward the far shore for the night, her arms aching in the honest, uncomplicated way. Her body aches after real work, her breath slow, and for the first time all that long day, nothing in her arguing with the ache at all. What was Sata actually carrying? In those last exhausted strokes across the darkening river, not simply a tired body. Every waterman and every farmer on that river went home tired most evenings of their lives, and none of them thought much of it. She was carrying something heavier than fatigue. She was carrying the belief that tiredness itself was a kind of failure, a debt owed and left unpaid, a weakness to be fought and defeated, rather than a fact to be felt and finally set down. That is the second arrow of exhaustion, and it is one of the quietest arrows there is. The first is the plain, unremarkable fact of a long day, a body that has given what it had to give, hour after hour, until there is simply less left than there was that morning. The second is the anger we turn back on ourselves for having given out at all, as though rest were something that first had to be earned through still more effort, rather than simply what a tired body has been asking for all along, patiently, the way the river asks nothing of anyone and simply keeps moving. Everyone's arms get tired. You may know this particular weight tonight, in whatever form it has taken for you. Not only the fatigue of the day now behind you, but the quieter, second current riding on top of it. The sense that you should have more left in you than you do, that you should be managing better, holding more, needing less. That argument has never once, in the whole history of tired bodies, made anyone less tired. It has only ever made the tiredness harder to rest inside of, harder to simply feel without also defending against. Sata's arms did not stop aching the moment the old woman spoke to her from the stern of the boat. The ache did not vanish, and it was never going to vanish that easily. It was simply allowed, at last, to be exactly what it was, real, earned, and enough on its own, without a second current of anger pulling against it from underneath. That is so often the whole of what changes, when anything changes at all, not the tiredness itself, which was always going to be there at the end of a long enough day. Only the fight laid on top of it, which never needed to be there in the first place. Let your own arms rest now, however they happen to be lying against the bed. Let your legs go heavy the way Sata finally let her arms go heavy over the oar, without asking them to prove anything more to anyone tonight, least of all to yourself. If some part of you is tired, truly, honestly tired, the particular way a body is tired after giving what it actually had to give, let that be simple. Let it be a fact, plain and unremarkable, not a failing that needs correcting before you are allowed to rest. There is nothing left to fight in that tiredness. There never really was, even on the nights it felt like there was. Breathe in, slowly, and feel the whole quiet weight of the day settle down into the mattress beneath you, the way a boat finally settles against its mooring after the last crossing of the evening. Breathe out, slowly, and let go of the second weight along with it, the private argument, the quiet insistence that you should somehow be less tired than you actually are. That argument you may have been carrying since long before tonight. Somewhere in that same slow current runs another shape of trouble. Not the tiredness of the body this time, but a different kind of tiredness. The tiredness of hearing an old voice in your head say something it said to you once, still saying it tonight, still finding you here in the dark, long after the moment itself has gone still, and the person who said it may have long since forgotten they ever did. And perhaps, somewhere in that returning current, the old voice Sata carried home with her tonight is not so different from one you have carried yourself for longer than tonight, longer perhaps than you have ever said out loud. You know the particular tiredness of an old sentence that will not stay where it happened. A single line, spoken once, maybe years ago, by someone who has likely long forgotten they ever said it. And yet somehow, it still finds you here, in the dark, playing itself again with the same tone, the same pause, the same small silence afterward that used to mean something was wrong with you. Not the memory of an event, the memory of a verdict. It rarely arrives when you invite it. It arrives instead in the quiet moments just before something matters, before a difficult conversation, before a piece of work you care about, before sleep itself, as though some old part of you believes that hearing the criticism one more time might finally prepare you for it, might finally make it smaller. It never does. It only makes the night longer. The Buddha taught that the mind does not simply remember pain, it often recreates it, summoning the same wound again and again, as though repetition might finally resolve what a single hearing could not. The mind mistakes rehearsal for readiness, as though replaying a wound enough times might finally drain it of its power, when in truth, each replaying only wears the same groove a little deeper. Long ago, in a quiet town known for its calligraphy houses, a young scribe named Wen learned just how long a single sentence could be made to last. The calligraphy hall smelled of ink long before it smelled of anything else. That dark, mineral scent that seemed to live permanently in the wooden beams. Then came the soft, steady scratch of brush against paper, dozens of students working at once. A sound like rain that never quite fell, and beneath Wen's own hand, the cool weight of his brush, balanced exactly the way his teacher had shown him the very first week, years before he had a reason to doubt it. Wen had been the finest student in that hall for 3 years running, praised by visiting scholars, requested by name for the temple's spring commissions. Other students had long since stopped resenting his talent and simply asked to watch him work, the way one watches weather change. None of that was what he remembered on nights like this one. What he remembered was a single afternoon, long past now, when his teacher had lifted one of his scrolls in front of the entire hall, pointed to a single character near the bottom, and said, not unkindly but not gently either, that the stroke was weak, that it revealed a hand still governed by fear rather than confidence. That was all his teacher had said. A dozen words, spoken once, years ago, about a single stroke on a single scroll, long since given away or lost. Its ink faded by now, its paper likely yellowed in some collector's drawer, if it had survived at all. And yet, Wen had gone on, every season since, replaying that exact sentence before every commission, every exhibition, every scroll he set his brush to, as though the words themselves had taken up permanent residence somewhere behind his ribs, waiting only for silence to speak again. Tonight, preparing a scroll for the temple's autumn ceremony, his hand paused above the paper, and the old sentence rose again, uninvited, the way it always did before anything that mattered. A hand still governed by fear. His fingers tightened slightly on the brush. An old woman who swept the hall each evening, who had swept it since before Wen was born, paused near his table with her broom resting against one shoulder. "You've stopped again," she said. "You do that before the important scrolls. Always the same pause, right about here." She said it the way one might mention the weather, without judgment, simply naming what she had watched happen season after season. "I'm only thinking," Wen said. "You're listening," the old woman said. "There's a difference. Thinking moves forward. Listening just repeats whatever it already heard." Wen set the brush down, surprised by how exposed the small motion left him feeling. "There was a teacher, years ago," he said. "My hand showed fear. I've never quite gotten past it." "Has he said it since?" "No. He's been gone from this hall a long time now." "Then who's still saying it?" the old woman asked, not unkindly, resting her broom fully against the wall now. "Done for the evening." Wen opened his mouth to answer and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he had none ready. The teacher had spoken the sentence exactly once. Wen had spoken it back to himself, by his own count, thousands of times since, in temple halls and quiet rooms, and now, once more, at this very table. "I suppose I am," he admitted, and something in his own voice, hearing it out loud for the first time, sounded almost foolish to him, though not unkindly foolish. Simply tired. The way a long-held pose becomes tired once you finally notice you have been holding it, and has all that repeating, the old woman said, ever once made the stroke stronger. Wen looked down at the blank paper in front of him, at his own hand resting beside it. Steady now, in a way it had not been a moment ago. He picked the brush back up, and this time, when he began, the old sentence did not rise to meet him. It was still there somewhere. He suspected it always would be, but it had, for this one evening, stopped insisting on being heard first. The words were spoken once. I am the one still speaking them. What was Wen actually holding? In that pause above the blank paper, not the memory of a single afternoon, long since faded at the edges. He was holding the belief that keeping the old sentence alive was somehow protecting him, that if he ever stopped repeating it, the fear it named might quietly return and ruin everything it had. Until now, kept careful. That is the deeper layer beneath an old voice that will not leave. Not simply the sting of what was once said, but a quiet bargain we strike without ever agreeing to it out loud. If I keep punishing myself with this, perhaps I will never have to feel it land again from somewhere outside myself. The repeating becomes a kind of armor, worn so long it starts to feel like skin, and taking it off, even for one night, can feel like standing exposed in a way that has nothing to do with the original words at all. Who's still saying it? Not every old sentence is kept alive out of habit alone. Some are kept alive on purpose, guarded almost, because some part of us has come to believe that guarding itself is what keeps us safe. That setting it down would mean setting down our own carefulness along with it, as though the two had ever truly been the same thing. In a small foundry town famous for its temple bells, an old bell caster named Hock had cast bells for nearly 40 years, and every one of them, by the judgment of every temple that had ever rung them, had been true. Every one but the first. The foundry announced itself long before it came into view. First the low, banked heat rising off the road even from a distance. Then the rhythmic clang of hammer against cooling bronze, patient and unhurried. And closer still, the dark smell of ash and scorched clay that clung to everything in that town. The walls, the clothing, even, people said, the well water. Though Duck had never quite believed that part. His very first bell, cast when he was barely more than an apprentice himself, had come out of the mold with a hairline flaw near the rim, invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the ear. A faint, wrong note buried inside every otherwise perfect ring. The temple had kept it anyway, out of kindness to a young caster, and it still hung in a small shrine at the edge of town, ringing its small, flawed note every morning for 4 decades. A sound the townspeople had long since stopped noticing at all, though Hawk never had. Hawk's own apprentice, a boy named Duke, found him one evening standing before that very bell, as Hawk often did before beginning any new casting. "You always come here first," Duke said. "Before every new bell. Why this one, when it's the only flawed bell you've ever made?" "Because it reminds me," Hawk said, not turning from the bell. "It keeps my hands honest." "Does it?" Duck said, echoing without quite meaning to the old woman's tone from a town he had never visited. "Or does it just keep you afraid?" Hawk turned then, something in his face shifting. "Every bell I've cast since has been true. Every single one. Because I never forget what carelessness sounds like." "You haven't been careless in 40 years, Duck said gently. "You were careless once, as a boy no older than I am now. You've been standing in front of that one flaw ever since, as if it were still waiting to happen again. As if 40 years of true bells could be undone by a single morning of forgetting to visit this shrine." Hawk said nothing for a long moment, listening to the small shrine bell stir faintly in the evening wind. Its familiar, imperfect note rising and falling. "If I stop coming here," he said finally, quietly, "what keeps me careful?" "The 40 true bells behind you," Duke said. "Not the one flawed bell in front of you. You've been guarding a door that closed a very long time ago." Hawk looked at the bell a while longer, and then, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he turned and walked back toward the foundry, without pausing to touch its worn bronze rim on his way past, the way he always had before, when believed that repeating the old sentence kept his hand honest. Hawk believed that standing before his one flawed bell kept his casting true. Both men had mistaken vigilance for protection, when in fact the vigilance itself had become the heavier weight, far heavier than whatever it was meant to guard against. The old sentence, the one flaw, the single stroke once called weak, none of it needed to be forgotten entirely for either man to rest. It only needed to stop being the first thing summoned before every new page, every new bell, every new beginning. Forgetting was never the task, only the quiet loosening of a grip that had outlived the danger it was meant to guard against, one that neither man had ever quite noticed tightening in the first place. Perhaps you are still standing, tonight, in front of some small flawed bell of your own, some old sentence you have kept alive, not out of habit, but out of a quiet, unexamined fear that letting it go might mean letting go of your own carefulness along with it. 40 true bells behind you. Let your hands go still now, wherever the old sentence has been living in your body. The shoulders, the jaw, the place just behind the ribs. You do not have to answer it again tonight. Whatever was once said to you, it was said once. Every repeating since has been your own voice, and your own voice, tired as it is tonight, is allowed to finally set the old sentence down without fear that something careless will rush in to take its place. The 40 true bells are still behind you, whatever your own 40 true bells happen to be. However quietly they have been ringing all this time while you kept facing the one that never quite came out right. Breathe in and feel the weight of that old voice loosen its hold, just slightly, the way a hand finally loosens around something it has been gripping far too long. Breathe out and let the room hold you instead. Quiet, unjudging, asking nothing further of you tonight. There is no scroll to finish, no bell to cast, only this one breath, and the one after it, arriving without needing to prove anything at all. Somewhere close by, in another life, not so different from your own. Someone else is standing before a small mistake they cannot undo, wondering whether it is possible to keep walking with it rather than standing forever in front of it. That is where we go next. The bells behind Hock, 40 true and 1 flawed, are still ringing somewhere in the dark. And if you listen closely enough, you may notice you have your own version of that shrine, a place in the mind you keep returning to, not because anyone asks you to, but because some part of you has never quite finished standing in front of it. Perhaps it is not a bell at all in your version. Perhaps it is a single sentence you wish you had phrased differently. A door you closed a little too hard. A moment you replay, not because it still holds any danger, but because some part of you has never quite been told it is allowed to stop. There is a particular ache that has nothing to do with what happened and everything to do with the fact that it cannot be undone. Not forgiven, not undone, not fixed, simply finished, in a way the mind refuses to accept as finished, circling back again and again, as though enough circling might somehow reopen a door that closed on its own a long time ago. You may know this ache by a dozen different names, depending on the year of your life it visited, but it always carries the same shape, a hand reaching toward something that has already set, hoping, this time, it might still be soft enough to reshape. The Buddha taught that clinging to what cannot be changed is its own separate suffering, distinct from whatever loss or mistake caused the clinging in the first place. Long ago, in a small weaving village known for its ceremonial silk, a young weaver named Chi learned the difference between a mistake and the years she spent unable to set it down. The weaving house held its own particular quiet, broken only by the steady clack of the loom's shuttle passing back and forth, a rhythm so constant it seemed to breathe on its own. Beneath that, the dry rustle of raw silk threads catching the afternoon light where it slanted through the open doorway. And underneath everything, the sweet smell of the dye vat simmering in the courtyard beyond, deep red and indigo blue, tended since before dawn. Chi had been commissioned to weave the ceremonial cloth for her closest friend's wedding, the finest work of her young career, a piece meant to carry 2 families' good fortune into a new household. Its pattern drawn from a design her own grandmother had used only once, decades earlier, for a wedding still spoken of in the village with quiet reverence. Chi had spent 3 months on it, thread by thread, pattern by pattern, rising before dawn most mornings to catch the best light through the workroom's east window. And on the very evening she meant to finish, reaching for the wrong dye pot in the gathering dusk, her hand moving on instinct through a motion she had performed 1,000 times without error. She ruined it. The red bled where it should never have touched the white. A single careless stroke of color spreading through months of work in the space of a breath. Chi stood over the ruined cloth for a long time that night, unable to move, unable to cry, simply staring at the stain, the way one stares at something too large to fully understand. There was no time to weave another before the wedding. She told her friend the truth that same night, walking to her house in the dark, rather than waiting for morning to soften the news. And her friend, gracious in her disappointment though, clearly wounded by it, I found another weaver to finish a simpler piece in time. The wedding went forward. The marriage was, by every account that reached Chi afterward, a happy one. And still, a full year later, Chi had not forgiven herself for that single evening. She kept the ruined cloth folded at the bottom of a chest in her workroom, and on nights when a new commission proved difficult, she would sometimes take it out and look at it, as if the old stain might explain something the current work could not. Her grandmother, who had taught her to weave and still visited the workroom most afternoons to sit in the same worn spot by the window, found her like that one evening, the ruined cloth spread across her knees in the low lamplight, her fingers moving slowly over the old stain, the way one might trace a scar to confirm it is still there. "You're looking at it again," the old woman said, settling onto the bench beside her without being asked. "I ruined the most important cloth I've ever made," Chi said. "A whole year, and I still think about it every time I sit down at the loom." "Do you think about the 40 pieces you've finished since her grandmother asked? The ones that hang in 3 different households now, that will be worn for weddings you'll never even see?" "That's not the same," Chi said. "Why not?" Chi looked down at the stained silk in her lap, tracing the edge of the red bleed with one finger, the way she had traced it 100 times before, the motion almost automatic by now, a habit her hands seemed to know better than her mind did. "Because this one I can't fix. The others, if something went wrong, I could unweave a section, start again. This is finished. Wrong, and finished." Her grandmother took the cloth gently from her hands and folded it back into its familiar shape. "It is finished," she agreed. "You said that as though it were the problem. I think it might be the only mercy in the whole story." Chi looked up at her, not understanding. "You cannot fix it," her grandmother said. "So you don't have to keep trying. The cloth already knows what it is. It's only you who keeps asking it to become something else." She sat with that for a long moment, her hands finally still in her lap instead of tracing the old stain. The lamplight steady between them, the loom silent for once in the corner of the room. She did not answer right away. But when her grandmother rose to leave, Chi folded the cloth one more time, carefully, the way one folds something precious rather than something shameful. And this time, when she set it back in the chest, she closed the lid without lingering. The cloth already knows what it is. What was Chi actually holding on to? In that chest, in those late-night visits to a stain that would never change, not the hope of fixing it. She knew better than anyone, that fixing it was impossible, had known it the moment the red first touched the white. She was holding on to something closer to penance, the belief that continuing to suffer over the mistake was somehow owed to the friend she had disappointed. As though her own ongoing pain could retroactively soften what had already happened. As though enough private suffering might eventually earn back a moment that had already irrevocably passed. It could not. It never can. The mistake was finished the moment the dye touched the silk. Everything after that was simply Chi, alone, deciding again and again to keep the wound open. It's only you who keeps asking it to become something else. A finished mistake asks nothing further of us. It is only the mind, circling back out of habit or guilt or a private, unspoken belief that suffering equals responsibility, that keeps reopening what time itself has already closed. 3 years after that ruined wedding cloth, Chi's workroom looked much as it always had. The same east-facing window, the same worn bench her grandmother once sat on, except that a new apprentice now sat at the second loom. A girl named Mai, quick-fingered and eager, who had come to Chi the previous spring to learn the craft properly, and who had heard the story of the ruined cloth from someone in the village, told the way village stories always are. A little larger than the truth, and one quiet afternoon finally worked up the courage to ask about it directly. "Is it true?" Mai said, not looking up from her own thread work, "that you ruined a wedding cloth once, a whole season's work?" "It's true," Chi said, without pausing her own shuttle. "Doesn't it bother you, sitting here every day, doing the same work that once went so wrong?" Mai finally looked up as she asked it, her shuttle stilled mid-pass, as though the question itself required both hands to hold. Chi's shuttle continued its steady rhythm, back and forth, unhurried. "It bothered me for a long time, longer than it needed to, probably." "What changed?" "My grandmother told me something I didn't understand for a while," Chi said. "That the cloth was finished. Not fixed. Not forgiven. Just finished. And once something is finished, there's nothing left to do with it, but let it be what it already is." Mai considered this, her own hands slowing at the loom, the shuttle resting idle in her palm. "But you still remember it?" "I do," Chi said. "I probably always will. But remembering it isn't the same as still trying to change it. Most mornings now, I don't think of it at all. I think of this thread, and the next one, and the one after that." Mai looked down at her own work, a length of pale blue silk, not yet a third finished, and Chi caught her glancing, almost involuntarily, toward the small stain near the base of her own current piece, a thread pulled too tight days earlier, a flaw she had been quietly agonizing over since. "That one," Chi said gently, nodding toward it. "You've looked at it 4 times since you sat down." Mai's hand stilled, caught. "I keep thinking I should unweave the whole section." "You could," Chi said. "Or you could let it be finished, the way I finally let mine be finished, and weave forward from here instead of backward into it." Mai looked at her own small flaw a moment longer, then, slowly, picked her shuttle back up and continued on, the thread moving forward instead of back. Chi learned to stop reopening a mistake that had already closed on its own. "May," watching her, began learning the same thing years earlier than she had, spared the full weight of the years she herself had spent circling back to that chest. Neither woman needed the original flaw to disappear, and neither woman ever fully forgot it. Not the red bleeding into white, not the small, tight thread near the base of an unfinished blue. They needed only to stop asking those flaws to become something other than what they already, finally, were. That is what living alongside an old mistake actually looks like. Not a dramatic forgiveness arriving in a single flash of understanding. Not one sudden morning of complete peace after years of none. But something far quieter and far more ordinary. A Tuesday at a loom. Threads moving forward instead of circling endlessly back toward a stain that time had already finished with. Long before the mind itself was finally willing to agree. Weave forward from here instead of backward into it. Let your own hands rest now, wherever they are lying, and let go, just for tonight, of whatever old mistake you may still be quietly unfolding in some private chest of your own, taken out on the difficult nights, examined by candlelight, as though this time the stain might finally explain itself differently. Whatever it was, it is likely finished in the way cheesecloth was finished, wrong and complete, asking nothing further of you except your willingness to finally believe it. You do not have to fix it tonight. You do not have to forgive it tonight. And you certainly do not have to forget it, since forgetting was never really the task to begin with. You only have to let your hands go still, the way Chi's grandmother let the old silk go still in her lap, folded, closed, no longer needing to be looked at by candlelight. Breathe in and feel whatever old thread you have been holding loosen, just slightly, in your chest, the way a knot loosens once a hand finally stops pulling at it. Breathe out and let tonight be simply another thread moving forward, unhurried, uncounted, needing nothing from the one before it. Somewhere out past this room, in a season not yet arrived, something you are waiting for may or may not come the way you hope. That waiting, too, has its own quiet weight, and it is where we turn next. There is a particular window of time before something is decided, before a letter arrives or does not, before a boat returns or does not, when the mind seems to believe that worrying hard enough might tip the outcome in its favor, as though enough attention paid to an uncertain thing could somehow will it into the shape we need. It is one of the oldest tricks the mind plays on itself, this quiet bargain that vigilance equals influence, that if we only watch closely enough, care hard enough, hold our breath long enough, we might somehow reach across the distance and touch the outcome before it arrives, might somehow bend an uncertain future toward the shape we need it to take. You know this waiting, not the waiting itself, which is only time passing the way time always passes, but the particular tightness that gathers around it, the checking and rechecking of a door, a road, a horizon, as though looking one more time might finally produce the answer that 100 previous times did not. The waiting asks nothing of you. The tightness around it asks everything. The Buddha taught that suffering often grows not from what has not yet happened, but from the mind's insistence on deciding, in advance, exactly how it should happen. Long ago, in a small fishing village along a quiet stretch of coast, a woman named Lien learned just how much of her own life could be spent standing at the edge of water, waiting for something, The water itself had no obligation to give back on schedule. The village woke each morning to the same unhurried rhythm. The slap of waves against the hulls, still resting on the sand. The low creak of rope as boats were checked and readied. And beneath it all, the smell of salt and drying fish nets, sharp and briny, carried inland on whatever wind happened to be blowing that day. Children ran along the tide line before school, gathering shells that would be forgotten by noon, and old men mended nets in the shade of leaning palm trees, their hands moving through knots they no longer needed to look at. Decades of practice living in their fingers rather than their eyes. By late afternoon, the same rhythm reversed itself. Boats returning one by one along the horizon. Small dark shapes resolving slowly into something recognizable only once they were close enough to name. Lien's husband, a fisherman named Tam, had gone out with the others that morning, as he did most mornings, and by the time the sun had begun its long slide toward the water, most of the village's boats had already returned, their catches sold, their nets already drying on the racks near the shore, the day's business folding itself back into ordinary evening. Tam's boat was not among them. This was not, in itself, unusual. Some days the fish ran further out, and a good catch was worth the extra hours. A fact every fishing family in the village understood without needing it explained. Lien knew this too, had known it for the 11 years of their marriage, had watched dozens of ordinary late returns end exactly as they should, with Tam's boat finally rounding the point just as the light went from gold to grey. His tired wave from the deck, the same every time, and still, every single time. She stood at the edge of the water, from the moment the other boats returned until his did, unable to do anything else, unable even to sit, as though standing there, watching hard enough, might somehow hurry him home. Her husband's mother, an older woman named Ba Sao, who had spent 40 years married to a fisherman herself, before he died peacefully in his own bed at a fine old age, found Liang exactly where she always found her on these evenings, standing at the tide line, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the horizon, her whole body angled toward the water the way a plant angles itself toward light it cannot yet feel. "You'll wear a path in the sand at this rate," Basao said, coming to stand beside her, not quite touching her, but close enough that their shoulders nearly met. The older woman's presence steady and unhurried in a way that made Lien's own tension feel suddenly more visible than she wanted it to be. "I can't help it," Lien said, not taking her eyes off the water. "If I stop watching, and something has happened, I won't have been here for him." Watching from the shore has never once brought a boat in faster, Ba Sao said. "I stood exactly where you're standing for the better part of 40 years. It never once made a difference to the boat. It only ever made a difference to me." Lien turned to her, surprised, her own arms loosening slightly without her quite deciding to loosen them. "You still worried, even after 40 years?" "Every single evening," Basao said, a small, tired smile crossing her face, the smile of someone who had made peace with a truth rather than defeated it. "The worrying never got smaller. What changed was what I did with it while I waited." "What did you do with it?" Basao was quiet a moment, watching the horizon herself now, the last of the boat's shapes still too small to name, her weathered hands folded loosely in front of her, nothing urgent in the way she held herself, despite the same uncertainty Leanne was drowning in. For the first 10 years, I stood exactly like you, watching every wave as if it might tell me something, as if I could read the water the way I read my husband's face. For the 10 after that, I made myself walk home and start the rice, and let the worry come with me instead of standing guard over the water. The worry never left either way. But cooking, at least, gave it somewhere to go besides my own chest. And if something had happened while you were home with the rice instead of watching, Leanne asked, the question carrying more fear in it than she had intended to reveal, then I would have found out exactly as quickly either way. Basao said, her voice carrying no bitterness, only a plain acceptance worn smooth by decades. The water was never going to send word faster because I stood here, staring at it. It only ever made the waiting heavier, without making the boat come home any sooner. 40 years, and the sea never once cared whether I was watching. Leanne looked back out at the water, at the handful of shapes still resolving slowly along the horizon, none of them yet close enough to be Tam's. Her arms, she noticed, were still wrapped tightly around her own body, as though holding herself together might somehow hold the situation together too. Come help me with the rice, Basao said, not as a command, simply an offer, already turning toward the path up from the beach, her sandals leaving small, unhurried prints in the wet sand. You can still see the water from the kitchen window. You don't have to choose between waiting and living. You've just never tried doing both at once. Leanne hesitated only a moment before following her, casting one last look at the horizon, still empty of the one shape she wanted, the sky beginning its slow shift toward the deeper colors of early evening. By the time the rice had come to a boil, the small kitchen filling with steam, and the familiar smell of grain softening in water, Tam's boat had rounded the point, exactly as it had every other time it ran late. The extra hours explained by nothing more dramatic than a good catch further out than usual. Leanne saw it first from the kitchen window, a small dark shape catching the last orange light, and felt the tightness in her chest loosen all at once. The same relief she always felt, but this time, arriving to a body that had not spent the whole evening standing rigid at the water's edge, arms crossed like a woman bracing for bad news that never actually came. The water was never going to send word faster. What was Leanne actually doing? Standing at that tide line evening after evening, watching a horizon that owed her nothing, not truly waiting, though it looked like waiting from the outside. She was trying to control an outcome that had already been decided somewhere out past sight, hours before she could possibly know it, through the simple, exhausting belief that her own vigilance was doing something useful, that looking hard enough at an uncertain thing might somehow soften whatever it turned out to be, might somehow prepare her more thoroughly than simply living her evening and finding out when the boat arrived. It never does. The boat returns on its own time, or it does not, entirely independent of how tightly anyone on shore holds their own arms while they wait. The sea has never once consulted the woman standing on the beach before deciding when to send a boat home. You don't have to choose between waiting and living. This is perhaps the hardest kind of waiting there is, the kind with no clear end in sight, no letter that will certainly come, no boat guaranteed to round the point by evening. Leanne's waiting, at least, ended most nights the way she hoped, Not every waiting does. And both of those truths are allowed to sit together without one cancelling out the other. And still, the shape of the suffering is the same either way. The tightening around an outcome none of us can control from the shore. However hard we stand there watching for it, however much we tell ourselves that this time, watching harder might make the difference it never made before. There is a particular loneliness in this kind of waiting too. The sense that no one else quite understands the weight of standing at your own private tide line, checking a phone that has not rung, a door that has not opened, a silence that has not yet resolved into either the news you hoped for or the news you feared. Ba Sao's 40 years at the water's edge did not make her waiting disappear. It only taught her that the waiting could be carried differently, could be set down for an hour at a time without abandoning the person she was waiting for, could exist alongside an ordinary evening instead of consuming the whole of it. The rice still needing to be cooked, the day still needing to be lived, regardless of what the horizon eventually decided to show her. Some nights, Ba Sao had admitted once, long after this particular evening, the boat came in very late indeed, later than usual, late enough that even the rice in the kitchen window could not fully hold the worry at bay. Those nights were real, and they deserved their own honesty rather than a tidy resolution. But even on those nights, she said, the standing and staring never once shortened the wait by even a single minute. It only made the minutes themselves harder to survive. Let your own arms loosen now. Wherever they have been holding something, they cannot actually influence by holding it tighter. Whatever you are waiting for tonight, a call that has not come, an answer not yet given, a season not yet arrived, a result not yet known. Your watching it will not make it arrive any sooner, and your resting will not make it arrive any later. The waiting continues either way, indifferent to how you spend the hours inside it, indifferent to how tightly your own chest has been holding itself against whatever the outcome turns out to be. Breathe in and feel your shoulders lower, just slightly, away from your ears, the way Lian's shoulders finally lowered somewhere between the tide line and the kitchen door. Breathe out and let there be, for tonight at least, something else besides the horizon to rest your attention on. The weight of the blanket, the sound of your own breath, the simple fact of this one moment, which asks nothing of you except to be here, inside it, not watching, not bracing, only resting, somewhere close to sleep. Another kind of watching waits its turn, not toward a horizon this time, but toward someone else entirely. Someone who seems, from where you stand, to have gotten the very thing you have been hoping for yourself. A happiness that looks, from a distance, easier and more certain than your own. Somewhere out past the kitchen window where Lian finally let her shoulders rest, another kind of ache waits its turn tonight. Quieter than fear, harder to name out loud. The kind that rises not when something goes wrong for us, but when something goes right for someone else. You know this feeling, even if you have rarely admitted it by its plain name. A friend's good news lands, and something in your chest tightens half a second before the rest of you manages a smile. A colleague is praised for work not so different from your own. Someone else seems to have arrived, easily, at the very thing you have been striving toward for years. The feeling that follows is rarely pride in them. More often it is a small, private ache, and close behind the ache, a second wave of shame for having felt it at all, as though the ache itself were proof of some quiet failure in your own character. The Buddha taught that envy arises naturally in an untrained mind, the way weather arises, and that the suffering is rarely in the envy itself, but in what we do once it appears, whether we feed it until it hardens into bitterness, or whether we simply let it pass through, the way weather always eventually does. Long ago, in a mountain monastery known for the beauty of its morning chanting, two young monks discovered two very different answers to that same question. The monastery woke each day before the light did, the cold stone floors sending a familiar chill up through bare feet, the smell of incense already curling from the main hall where the first bell had not yet rung, and somewhere beyond the walls, the low murmur of wind moving through pine trees that had stood on that mountain longer than the monastery itself. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the courtyard would already be full of the soft, overlapping rhythm of morning chores, water drawn from the well, rice measured into pots, sandals shuffling along worn stone paths toward the main hall. Jian and Shu had entered the monastery the same season, 9 years earlier, trained under the same teacher, chanted the same sutras every morning at the same hour, and had, in the ordinary way of two young men who had grown up together in all but blood, become something closer to brothers than fellow monks. For most of those 9 years, their skills had grown at roughly the same pace, close enough that neither had reason to compare himself against the other, close enough that Jian had never once had to ask himself what it might feel like to watch Shu succeed at something he himself had quietly hoped for. That changed the autumn the abbot chose Shu, and Shu alone, to lead the chanting for the monastery's largest annual ceremony, the one attended by travelers from 3 neighboring villages, the one every monk in the hall had quietly hoped, at least once, to be asked to lead. Jian said nothing when the announcement was made. He bowed with the others, offered Shu a brief nod of congratulation in the hallway afterward, and told himself, that first evening, that he was simply tired, nothing more, that the tightness in his chest was only the cold settling into his bones the way it always did as autumn deepened. But in the weeks that followed, something in him began, quietly, to change. He found himself listening for flaws in Shu's chanting during morning practice, noting them with a private, uncharitable satisfaction he would never have admitted to anyone, least of all himself. He began arriving to shared meals a little later than usual, sitting a little further down the table, choosing tasks that kept him occupied elsewhere during the hours Shu practiced. When Shu asked, one evening, whether Jian would help him rehearse a difficult passage, the way they had helped each other rehearse difficult passages for 9 years running, Jian said he was too occupied with his own studies, though his own studies that week required nothing urgent at all. An old monk named Teacher Han, who had lived at the monastery longer than either young man had been alive, whose own hair had long since gone the color of the frost that settled on the courtyard stones each winter morning. He noticed the widening distance between them, the way one notices a hairline crack spreading slowly across a wall. Easy to miss at first glance, impossible to unsee once found. You've stopped walking to the hall together, Teacher Han said to Jian one morning, falling into step beside him on the path. We're both busy, Jian said, his eyes fixed on the path ahead rather than on his teacher's face. Shu has the ceremony to prepare for, Is that why you've stopped? Or is that only what you tell yourself when you notice you've stopped? Jian's jaw tightened, the words coming out sharper than he intended. I don't begrudge him the honor. He chants beautifully. He's earned it. Every word of that is true. I didn't ask whether you begrudged him the honor, Teacher Han said, mild as ever. I asked why you've stopped walking beside your oldest friend at this monastery. Jian said nothing for a long stretch of the path, the pine needles soft and silent underfoot. It's harder than I expected, he finally admitted, watching him get the thing I wanted, and having to look glad about it every single day. Teacher Han said, as though something had finally been confirmed rather than revealed. And so instead you've decided not to look at him at all. Jian stopped walking entirely. What else am I supposed to do? I can't make the feeling go away just by wanting it to. No, Teacher Han agreed. But you can stop punishing him for a feeling he never caused. The envy is yours. The distance you've put between you, that's a choice you're making on top of it. And it's costing you something the envy alone never would have. 9 years of walking this path together, and you've traded it for a feeling that would have passed on its own within a season, if you'd let it. The distance is a choice you're making on top of it. What was Jian actually protecting by pulling away from his oldest friend at that monastery? Not his own dignity, though it may have felt that way in the moment. Standing there on the path, with his jaw still tight, and his old teacher watching him with unhurried patience, he was protecting himself from having to feel the envy honestly, in front of someone he cared about. And so instead he let the feeling curdle into something colder and easier to justify. A quiet coldness that asked far less of him than honesty would have. That is often the deeper danger of envy, not the feeling itself, which passes on its own soon enough if we let it, but the story we build around it to avoid admitting we felt it at all. Bitterness is, in this way, envy's second arrow, sharper and far longer lasting than the first, capable of outliving the original feeling by years, long after the thing once wanted has been forgotten by everyone, but the one still guarding the distance it created. The envy is yours. Not everyone who feels envy turns it into distance. Some, more rarely, manage to let it pass through without ever needing to hide that it arrived at all. Years later, in that same monastery, a younger monk named Feng found himself overlooked for a task he had quietly hoped for, the honor of copying a newly arrived sutra scroll, a task given instead to a monk who had entered the monastery 2 full seasons after him. Feng felt the old, familiar tightness rise in his chest the moment the assignment was announced, standing there in the main hall among his fellow monks, and rather than hide it the way he might once have, he went that same evening to find Teacher Han, now much older, his steps slower on the courtyard stones, sitting in his usual place by the well as the last light faded from the sky. I'm ashamed to say this, Feng said, sitting down across from him. But when they announced who would copy the new scroll, I felt something ugly. Envy, I think. Maybe worse. What's ugly about envy? Teacher Han asked, not looking up from the tea he was pouring. Shouldn't a monk be past feeling that sort of thing by now? Teacher Han handed him a cup, unhurried, the tea steam rising thin and pale in the cooling evening air. Envy simply means you wanted something. Wanting is not a failure of practice. It's only proof you're still alive to your own life. Then why does it feel like something to hide? Because you've decided that feeling it means you're a worse monk than someone who never felt it. Teacher Han said, watching the steam curl upward between them. But I've known monks who claimed never to feel envy. Most of them were simply better at hiding it than you are tonight. Sitting here telling me the truth without my even having to ask for it. Feng turned the warm cup slowly in his hands. So what do I do with it? Drink your tea, Teacher Han said, almost smiling. Let it be there while you drink it. It will move through you on its own, the way weather moves through a valley, if you don't build it a house to live in. Feng sat a long while in the courtyard that evening. The envy present the entire time, neither denied nor fed, simply held the way the cup was held, warm in his hands until it finally cooled. The stars beginning to appear one by one above the monastery walls as the last of the daylight gave way to full dark. By the time he rose to return to his quarters, the feeling had already begun to loosen its grip. Not banished, exactly, but no longer occupying the center of his chest the way it had at the start of the evening. Jian built the feeling a house, and it settled in, coloring 9 years of friendship with a coldness that took much longer to undo than it had taken to arrive. A coldness that both men would later admit, once they finally spoke honestly of it, had cost them nearly a full year of the closeness they had once taken for granted. Feng let the same feeling pass through him in a single evening, honest and unashamed, and by morning it had gone the way weather goes, leaving no trace behind except the ordinary business of the day ahead. The sutra scroll still being copied by someone else, the loss still real, but no longer weighing on him the way it had the night before. Neither man chose whether the envy arrived. Both men chose what to do once it had. That is the only choice envy ever actually offers any of us, tonight included, and it is a far smaller, far kinder choice than most of us believe it to be while we are standing inside the feeling itself. Let it be there while you drink it. Let whatever quiet envy you may be carrying tonight simply be present, without needing to hide it from yourself and without needing to build it a house to live in either. It arrived because you wanted something, and wanting is not the failure your mind may be telling you it is tonight. Not a mark against your character, not evidence of anything except the plain fact that you are still fully alive to your own hopes. Breathe in, and let the feeling be exactly as warm or as sharp as it actually is, without adding shame on top of it, without needing to explain it away or defend against it. Breathe out, and let it move through you the way weather moves through a valley, here for a while, and then, on its own time, gone, leaving the valley exactly as it was before, ready for whatever weather comes next. Somewhere further along tonight, another kind of ache waits. Not envy this time, but grief, and the particular way we sometimes judge our own grieving, as though there were a correct way to lose someone, a right pace, a right depth, a right number of tears, when in truth, grief has never once followed anyone's schedule but its own. Grief, when it finally comes, rarely arrives the way we expect it to. It does not wait for a convenient hour, does not announce itself with any particular shape, and almost never matches the picture we carried beforehand of how a person is supposed to look while losing someone. That composed, dignified sorrow imagined in advance, so different from the messy, unpredictable thing grief actually turns out to be once it arrives. You may know the second kind of pain that grief brings, quieter than the loss itself, and in some ways harder to speak about. Not simply missing someone, but doubting your own way of missing them, wondering whether you have cried too little or too much, whether you should be further along by now, whether the particular shape of your sorrow means something is wrong with you rather than simply true of you. This second pain often arrives disguised as concern. Sometimes from others, sometimes from a quiet voice inside your own chest that has learned, somewhere along the way, to distrust the very grief it is carrying. The Buddha taught that grief itself is natural, the honest response of a heart that loved something it has now lost, but that a second suffering often grows on top of it, born not from the loss but from our own judgment of how we are carrying it. Long ago, in the ancient city of Savatthi, a woman named Patakara came to know both kinds of grief in the span of a single unbearable day. The road to Savatthi that season ran along fields still soft from recent rain, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and the particular green scent of new rice, shoots pushing up through the mud. And somewhere ahead, past a bend where the current ran high and fast, a river swollen well beyond its usual banks after days of storm. Patakara had set out that morning with her 2 young sons, hoping to reach her parents' home before the rains worsened further. Her husband already lost to a snake bite on the road only the night before. A grief so raw, she had barely had time to feel its full weight before the river forced itself between her and the only family she had left, its water higher and swifter than she had ever seen it in all her years traveling that same road as a girl, crossing that flooded water with 2 children and no husband beside her. She lost first her younger son to the current, and then, in the same terrible moment, to her older son, to a hawk that mistook the child's small movement for something else entirely. She reached the city that evening with nothing left of her family but the clothes on her back, only to learn, from a stranger on the road who did not yet know who she was, that her parents' house had collapsed in the same storm. Her mother, father, and brother all lost beneath the same roof that had once sheltered her whole childhood. What happened to Patakara's mind after that? The townspeople who witnessed it would speak of for years afterward, in tones that ranged from pity to something closer to disgust. She wandered the streets of Savatthi half senseless, with grief, her clothing forgotten, her hair unbound, crying out names that no longer had anyone left to answer them. Some people looked away, unable to bear the sight of her. Others whispered, as people often do when confronted with a grief too large to comfortably witness, about a woman who had clearly lost more than her family, who had lost herself along with them, who was grieving. Several remarked to each other in low, careful voices, in a manner no respectable woman should allow herself to grieve, however great her losses might have been. It was in this state that she came, by chance rather than intention, into the presence of the Buddha, who was teaching nearby that day. A small crowd gathered on the temple grounds, listening to his voice, unaware of the woman about to wander into their midst. Where the townspeople had seen only a shameful spectacle, he saw simply a woman drowning, and rather than turning away or adding his own judgment to hers, he spoke to her gently, asking her first only to cover herself, restoring some small dignity before anything else could be addressed at all. They say I have gone mad, Patachara said to him, Once enough clarity had returned to her voice to speak in full sentences, her body still trembling with the aftershock of the day. Perhaps I have. A mother should not survive her own children. A daughter should not outlive her parents in a single day and still be standing. Who decided? The Buddha asked her, what a person is permitted to feel on a day such as the one you have just lived through. Patakara had no answer ready. She had spent the walk into the city bracing not only against her own grief but against the judgment she felt certain would follow it. Certain that, whatever shape her sorrow took, it would be measured and found wanting by whoever witnessed it. Your grief is not the failure, he told her, his voice carrying none of the harshness the townspeople's whispers had carried. It is only proof of how completely you loved what you have lost. The judgment you are adding to it, the belief that you are grieving incorrectly, that is a second wound, entirely separate from the first, and it is the one you have the power to set down. Your grief is not the failure. Patakara did not stop grieving that day, nor in the days that followed. But something in her began, slowly, to separate the loss itself from the fear of grieving it wrongly. And in that separation, she found she could finally begin to breathe. What was Patakara actually carrying? Beyond the grief itself, in those first terrible hours in Savatthi, not only the deaths of everyone she loved, but the added weight of believing her own response to those deaths was itself a further failure. A second collapse layered on top of the first, judged not only by strangers on the street, but by some quiet part of herself that had absorbed their judgment before she ever heard it spoken aloud. That is often the deepest layer beneath grief that will not resolve, not the loss, which time and honest mourning can eventually soften, but the belief that our particular way of grieving is itself evidence of something broken in us, rather than simply evidence of how much we loved. A second wound, entirely separate from the first. Centuries later, in a small village far from that ancient city, a young widow named Swang learned a quieter version of the same truth. Not from a teacher, but from the ordinary cruelty of neighbors who believed they knew better than she did how a widow should behave. Swang's husband had died of fever only 2 months earlier, and by the time the village's autumn festival arrived, she had returned, cautiously, to some of her daily routines, drawing water at the communal well each morning, tending the small garden behind her house, occasionally even smiling when a neighbor's child said something unexpectedly funny. Small moments of ordinary life reasserting themselves despite the hollow place still left in her chest. It was this smiling, more than anything else, that seemed to trouble the women who gathered at the well each morning to wash and talk, their voices carrying easily across the water in the still morning air. 2 months, one of them murmured to another, just loud enough for Swang to hear as she filled her jug. And already smiling at children in the street. My own mother wore black for a full year when my father died, and wept every evening besides. Swang said nothing, filled her jug, and walked home with her back straight, though something in her chest had gone tight and cold the moment the words reached her. The walk home suddenly feeling longer than it ever had before. Each familiar step along the path, now carrying the weight of eyes she imagined watching from every window she passed. An older woman named Grandmother too, who had buried 2 husbands of her own across a long life. I found Swang later that same day, sitting alone behind her house, the garden untended for once, her eyes red, though no tears were currently falling. her hands resting empty in her lap, as though she had forgotten what task they were meant to be doing. "You heard them this morning," Grandmother too said, settling onto the bench beside her without needing to ask permission, her own joints creaking faintly with the effort of sitting. "They think I don't grieve him enough," Suong said. "Maybe they're right. I don't cry every evening anymore. Some mornings I even forget, for a moment, that he's gone, before it comes back to me all at once." "And does forgetting for a moment mean you loved him less?" Grandmother too asked. "I don't know," Suong admitted. "It feels like it should." "I buried 2 husbands," Grandmother too said, her gaze drifting toward the darkening tree line beyond the garden. "I grieved them both differently. The first, I wept for a year, exactly the way your neighbor's mother did, unable to imagine ever laughing again in this life. The second, I was laughing again within a season, because grief had already taught me, the first time, that the laughing didn't mean the love was any smaller. It only meant I was still alive. And life doesn't stop asking things of the living, no matter how much we've lost. So the women at the well are wrong. They're not wrong to grieve the way they grieve," Grandmother too said. "They're only wrong to believe their way is the only true way, and to hand you their grief like a measuring stick for your own. Your husband is gone. That loss is yours alone to carry, in whatever shape it actually takes, not the shape the well decides it should take." Suong sat with that a long while, the evening settling cool and quiet around them, the last birds of the day calling from somewhere in the trees behind the house. And for the first time since the whispers that morning, she felt something in her chest loosen that had nothing to do with the original grief at all. Patakara learned to separate her grief from a teacher's compassionate correction. In a single, overwhelming day, Suong learned the same separation more slowly, helped along by an old woman who had grieved enough of her own losses to know the difference between mourning and performing mourning, for an audience that had already decided what performance was acceptable, an audience that would never actually have to live inside the grief they were so quick to measure. Both women discovered the same quiet truth, that grief has no single correct shape, no required duration, no proper number of tears, and that the judgment we layer on top of our own sorrow, or accept from others who claim to know better, is never actually part of the grief itself. It is only ever an addition, and additions, unlike grief, can be set back down, however long they have been carried. Life doesn't stop asking things of the living. Whatever grief you may be carrying tonight, in whatever shape it has actually taken, let it be exactly that shape, without measuring it against some imagined correct version that exists only in comparison to someone else's loss, someone else's timeline, someone else's tears. You are not required to cry a certain amount, for a certain length of time, in a certain visible way, in order for your loss to be real or your love to have mattered. Breathe in and let go of whatever second judgment you may have added onto an already heavy grief. Breathe out and let the loss simply be present, honest, and entirely your own, without anyone else's measuring stick laid across it. Somewhere close to sleep, there is a different kind of ache waiting, not about someone lost, but about a version of yourself you sometimes feel you must defend, alone, without anyone else in the room to see how tired that defending has become. A quiet loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone and everything to do with feeling as though no one else could possibly understand. There is a particular ache that has nothing to do with being physically alone, and everything to do with the story that gets told inside that solitude. The quiet narration that turns simple aloneness into something heavier, something closer to a verdict than a fact. A body can be alone in a room and feel entirely at peace. A body can be surrounded by others and feel utterly unreachable. The difference has rarely been about how many people are actually present. You may know this feeling even in a room full of people. The sense of standing slightly apart from everyone else, watching connection happen nearby without quite being able to reach it yourself, smiling at the right moments while some quieter part of you remains just out of range of the conversation. And you may know it more sharply in true solitude, in a quiet house or an empty evening, where the mind, left alone with itself, often begins telling a story about why it is alone, a story that rarely stays neutral for long, drifting instead toward explanations that feel less like observations and more like quiet indictments. The Buddha taught that suffering often grows not from a circumstance itself, but from the story the mind builds around it. And that loneliness in particular tends to attract one of the oldest, most convincing stories the mind knows how to tell. The story that says the aloneness is proof of something lacking in us, rather than simply a fact of this particular season of life. A season that seasons, by their very nature, eventually pass. Long ago, on a forested mountain known for its charcoal burners, a man named Duong learned to tell the difference between the two, though it took him the better part of a decade to notice the distinction at all. The mountain held its silence differently depending on the hour. Thick and green in the long afternoons when cicadas filled the air with their endless dry rattle. Hollow and echoing at dusk when the wind moved through the upper branches like something breathing, and utterly still after dark, broken only by the occasional crack and settle of the charcoal kiln cooling somewhere behind Duong's small hut. Its smoke long since thinned to a faint grey thread rising against the darker grey of the evening sky. Duong had lived alone on that mountain for nearly a decade, ever since his wife had died of fever the same year their only child was stillborn. A double loss so total that he had walked up into the forest not long afterward and simply never fully walked back down. He kept his kiln burning, sold charcoal twice a season to traders who passed along the lower road, and spoke to almost no one for months at a stretch. His voice growing unfamiliar even to his own ears in the long silences between conversations. The villagers who remembered him from before called him the hermit, and had long since stopped expecting him at festivals or funerals, assuming, in the comfortable way people assume things about someone they rarely see, that he preferred it that way, that the mountain suited some quiet, solitary nature he had always secretly carried. A young traveler named Locke, caught by an early storm and separated from his companions on the lower trail, stumbled onto Duong's clearing well after dark, soaked through and shivering, his lantern long since gutted out somewhere in the driving rain, and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, welcomed inside without hesitation, fed a bowl of hot rice, and given a dry blanket beside the fire, before he had even fully explained who he was or how he had come to be there. "I expected you'd turn me away," Locke admitted, once the shivering had eased enough to let him speak clearly, the warmth of the fire finally reaching through to his wet clothes, his hands wrapped around the bowl of rice as though it were the only warm thing left in the world. "The traders on the lower road say the hermit up here doesn't care for visitors. that he keeps to himself and prefers it that way. The traders on the lower road have never actually visited, Duong said, mild, stirring the fire with a long stick, sparks rising briefly into the dark before fading against the deeper black of the forest beyond the clearing. It's easy to decide what a stranger prefers when you've never once asked him. Easier still to keep believing it once the story's been repeated enough times that no one thinks to check it anymore, least of all the man the story is supposedly about. "So, you don't mind the company?" Locke asked, watching the old man's weathered face in the firelight, trying to reconcile it with the stories he had heard on the road below, stories that had painted a very different picture of the man now sitting across from him. Duong considered the question longer than Locke expected, his stick still moving slowly through the coals, sending up small, brief showers of sparks that vanished almost as soon as they rose. "I've told myself for a long time that I don't. That I came up here because solitude suited me. Because I'd rather be alone than risk losing anyone else the way I lost my wife and child. It was easier to believe I'd chosen this than to admit the mountains simply became the place I hid once the grief got too large for the village to hold. Too large for anyone down there to know quite how to look at me without their own eyes filling." Locke said nothing, letting the fire crack and settle in the silence between them, sensing that the old man was not finished. 10 years, Duong went on, his voice quieter now, almost as though speaking more to himself than to the young man across the fire. "And I've told that story so many times, even to myself, that I nearly believed it completely. The hermit who prefers his own company, content on his mountain, needing nothing and no one. But tonight, a stranger stumbles into my clearing, half frozen, and I find I've made him rice and given him my second blanket without a moment's hesitation, without even pausing to decide whether I wanted the company. That's not the behavior of a man who prefers being alone. That's the behavior of a man who forgot, somewhere along the way, that he was allowed to want anything else. I forgot I was allowed to want anything else." Locke pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, watching the old charcoal burner's face in the firelight, weathered and quiet, holding a decade of solitude that suddenly seemed less like a preference and more like a story that had simply never been questioned, told once in the rawest days of grief, and repeated so faithfully afterward that even its author had stopped noticing it was a story at all. "Why tell me this?" Locke finally asked, genuinely curious now, rather than merely polite, pulling his knees up toward his chest as the fire's warmth finally began to reach through to his bones. "You don't know me at all. I'm only a stranger who wandered in out of the rain, and by morning I'll be gone down the mountain again." "Because you asked a true question," Duong said, setting the stirring stick aside now that the fire had settled into a steady, even glow, "and I realized, answering it, that I'd been giving myself a false one for 10 years. I told myself I was alone because I chose it. The truth is closer to this. I was alone because grief convinced me I no longer deserved anything else, and I never once checked whether that story was still true, or whether it had simply outlived whatever truth it once carried, back when the wound was still fresh enough to make almost any story feel believable." What was Duong actually protecting up on that mountain for 10 long years? Not simply his solitude, though it had come to look that way even to himself, and even, in time, to the villagers who had stopped questioning it. He was protecting an old story about his own worthiness, a story written in the rawest days of his grief and never once revisited since. A story that had long outlived whatever truth it once carried. If it had ever carried much truth at all beyond the raw logic of a man too broken to imagine wanting anything. That is often the quieter cruelty of loneliness, not the aloneness itself, which can be peaceful, even necessary, at times, restorative even, but the explanation the mind attaches to it without our full consent, an explanation that can calcify into identity if left unquestioned long enough, until the story and the self become nearly impossible to tell apart, until a man who was simply grieving becomes, in his own mind and everyone else's, a man who has always preferred to be alone, a story that had simply never been questioned. Not every story we tell about our own aloneness is true simply because it is old and familiar. Some stories are only old habits wearing the disguise of settled fact. Repeated so many times, they start to sound like conclusions rather than what they actually are. Guesses made once, in a much harder season, and never checked again since. Calcified over years of repetition into something that feels less like a belief and more like a simple, unquestionable truth about who we are. Duong walked Locke back down to the lower trail himself the next morning. Once the storm had cleared and the forest had begun steaming faintly in the returning sun, further than strictly necessary. Talking the whole way, in a manner Locke suspected the old hermit had not allowed himself in years. Asking about the villages Locke had passed through, the family waiting for him at the end of his travels. Small, ordinary questions that seemed to cost the old man something and give him something in equal measure. At the point where their paths finally divided, where the trail forked toward the lower valley and away from the mountain, Duong stopped. "Come back through in the spring," he said, somewhat gruffly, as though surprised by his own invitation. His eyes fixed somewhere just past Locke's shoulder rather than meeting them directly. "If the road brings you this way again, I'll have fresh charcoal by then, and rice enough for two." "I will," Locke said, and meant it, extending a hand that Duong took after only the briefest hesitation. Duong watched him go a while before turning back up the mountain path, his own steps a little lighter than they had been climbing down, carrying, for the first time in 10 years, the smallest possibility that the story he had told himself about who he was might not be the only story available to him after all. That a decade-old grief did not have to remain the final word on what he deserved. Let whatever story you have been telling yourself about your own aloneness be examined tonight, gently, without any need to solve it all at once or arrive at some tidy new conclusion before sleep. Perhaps it is true. Perhaps, like Duong's, it was true once, in a harder season, in a year you were simply trying to survive, and has simply never been questioned since, carried forward out of habit rather than continued relevance. Breathe in, and notice whatever explanation your own mind offers for whatever solitude you may be sitting inside tonight, without needing to argue with it or defend it. Breathe out, and let there be room, just for this one breath, for that explanation to be wrong, or at least no longer complete, no longer the only available account of who you are and what you deserve. Somewhere beyond tonight, another kind of weight is gathering, not about being alone, but about something not yet here, a future the mind has already begun to worry over long before it has any right to, spinning out possibilities and dangers that have not happened and may never happen at all. and yet somehow already feel as heavy in the chest as if they had. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living tonight and tomorrow night at the same time. The mind refusing to stay where the body actually is, wandering instead into a future that has not arrived, rehearsing versions of it that may never come to pass at all. The body lies still, breathing slows, and yet some other part of us keeps working through the night, as though standing guard over a threat that has not yet shown its face. Unwilling to stand down even when there is nothing left for it to actually do. You may know this restlessness, the mind circling an outcome that has not yet been decided, running through every way it might go wrong, as though enough rehearsal could somehow prepare you for whichever version actually arrives, or better still, to prevent the worst one from happening at all. It rarely works that way. The rehearsal changes nothing about tomorrow. It only steals something from tonight, the one thing that was actually available to you, the one thing you could have simply had, and instead spent bracing for a future that hasn't decided yet what shape it will take. The Buddha taught that much of our suffering is born not from what is actually happening, but from the mind's habit of living inside events that have not yet occurred, borrowing tomorrow's uncertainty and spending it as though it were already real, as though rehearsing a hardship in advance could somehow soften it or ward it off entirely. Long ago, in a river delta known for its rice, a farmer named Tho spent one long night discovering just how much of himself that borrowed worry could consume, and how little it actually returned to him in exchange. The fields outside R's window had turned the particular gold of rice 3 days from harvest. Heavy heads, bowing, the stalks low, catching what little moonlight slipped through the gathering clouds. And beneath that gold, the low, constant hum of insects rising from the wet paddies, a sound so familiar it had become nearly silence itself over the years he had lived beside it, joined now and then by the distant call of a night bird somewhere along the tree line, separating his land from his neighbors. This harvest mattered more than most. A poor season the year before had left little in reserve. The debts from replanting after a failed rainy season still not fully repaid, and the storm building somewhere out past the coast, still 2 days off by the last report from travelers on the main road, threatened to flatten the crop entirely if it arrived even a day early. Tho lay awake that night, running through every version of what might happen. The storm arriving early and drowning the fields. The storm holding off just long enough. The storm somehow worse than anyone had predicted. Each scenario replacing the last before he had even finished imagining its consequences. His mind moving through disaster after disaster with a kind of grim, exhausting thoroughness that left no room for anything else. Not sleep, not rest, not even simple stillness. His wife, Hin, woke sometime past midnight to find him sitting up in the dark, staring toward the window, though there was nothing to see but the vague grey shapes of the fields beyond it. His shoulders tense even in stillness, his hands resting on his knees as though braced for something. "You've been doing this for hours," she said, not quite a question, sitting up herself and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The storm could be here by tomorrow night instead of the day after, Tho said, his eyes still fixed on the invisible fields. If it comes early, we lose everything. If we harvest too soon to be safe, the rice won't be ready, and we lose part of the yield anyway. If we wait and I'm wrong about the timing, We lose it all a different way instead. Though, Hien's voice was steady, neither impatient nor alarmed, simply present. I keep trying to see which choice is safest, and every time I think I've found it, I imagine another way it could still go wrong. I've been through it a dozen different ways tonight, and I still don't feel any closer to knowing. Hien sat up beside him, pulling the blanket around both their shoulders against the night's growing chill, the fabric still warm from where she had been lying moments before, her voice unhurried despite the hour. How many times tonight have you already imagined the storm arriving early? Though considered this, genuinely trying to count. I don't know. A dozen. More. Probably, if I'm honest with myself. And each time, did imagining it change when the storm will actually arrive? Of course not. The answer came out almost before he had finished hearing the question, obvious the moment it was spoken aloud. Then what has all that imagining actually done? Besides keep you awake and leave you sitting here in the dark at an hour when you should be resting for whatever tomorrow actually brings. Doe had no answer ready. He looked out at the dark fields, gold, now only in memory, black and featureless in the moonless hour. It felt like preparing, he finally said. Like if I thought through every possibility, I'd be ready no matter which one happened. Hien was quiet a moment, watching the same dark shapes he had been staring at, the fields she knew as well as he did after 18 years beside him working this same land. Do you remember the harvest 3 years ago, the one where you were certain the early rains would ruin everything? Though thought back, the memory surfacing slowly. It rained for 2 days straight. I barely slept that week. And the harvest, it was fine, though admitted, better than fine. Actually, one of our best years. You spent that week just as certain of disaster as you are tonight, Hien said. The certainty didn't predict anything then either. It only cost you a week of sleep you never got back. You farmed this land 18 years, she went on. You already know when rice is ready to cut. You already know the signs of a storm building faster than expected, the particular color the sky turns, the way the wind shifts before the worst of it arrives. All of that knowledge is still here, in your hands, in your eyes. Whenever tomorrow actually arrives, it doesn't disappear just because you stop rehearsing disaster tonight. If anything, it gets harder to reach when you're this tired. But what if the timing is still wrong? Tho started to say. There will always be a what if, Hien said, gently but without softening the truth of it, her hand finding his in the dark. The storm is coming whenever it's coming, on its own schedule, entirely indifferent to how many versions of it you've already lived through in your own head tonight. Your rehearsing hasn't moved it an hour in either direction, hasn't changed the wind or the rain by even the smallest amount. It's only exhausted the one man who actually needs his wits about him when it finally arrives. The storm is coming whenever it's coming. Though sat with that a long while, the insects still humming steadily beyond the window, indifferent to the whole conversation. The same sound they had made every night of his 18 years farming this land. Storm or no storm, worry or no worry. A sound that had outlasted every crisis he had ever imagined, and would likely outlast this one too. Slowly, he felt something in his chest loosen. Not the worry itself, which had not vanished. But the exhausting effort of trying to live inside a dozen futures at once instead of the one night actually in front of him. The one bed, the one wife beside him, the one breath he was actually taking right now. "I still don't know what to decide," he admitted, his voice smaller now than it had been an hour ago. The fight gone out of it. "You don't have to decide tonight," Ian said, settling back against the pillow but keeping his hand in hers. "Tonight only asks you to sleep. Tomorrow will ask you to decide, and you'll be far more capable of a clear decision with rest behind you than with a night spent living through every disaster that hasn't happened yet and might never happen at all." What was To actually doing in those hours of turning the same uncertainty over and over in the dark? Not preparing, though it had felt that way at the time. It felt almost like diligence, like the responsible thing a good farmer does the night before an important harvest. He was trying to purchase, through sheer mental effort, a certainty that simply did not exist yet, spending the one resource he actually had, his rest, his clarity, his present capacity, on a future that would arrive on its own terms, regardless of how thoroughly he had rehearsed it beforehand. That is the particular cruelty of anticipatory worry, that it feels productive while doing nothing at all to change the outcome it fears, and costs something real in the process. The very steadiness that will actually be needed once the uncertain thing finally arrives and real decisions, rather than imagined ones, need to be made. The mind mistakes motion for progress, mistakes the churning of a dozen scenarios for the clarity that only rest, paradoxically, tends to provide. Tonight only asks you to sleep. The storm, when it came 2 days later, arrived close to schedule, giving Tho and his neighbors just enough time to bring in most of the crop before the worst of the wind and rain reached the delta. The sky turning the deep grey-green Tho had learned to recognize decades earlier from his own father. It was not a perfect harvest. Some of the outer fields flooded before they could be cleared, the water rising faster than anyone had expected in the final hours. But it was survivable, ordinary in its mixture of loss and preservation, the way most harvests actually turn out to be. Neither the disaster Tho had rehearsed a dozen times in the dark, nor a triumph free of any cost at all. What Tho remembered afterward, more than the storm itself, was how much clearer his thinking had felt on the day the real decisions needed making. Once, he had finally allowed himself, that one difficult night, to set the rehearsing down and simply rest. The knowledge he needed had been there all along, waiting quietly beneath the noise. Ready, the moment he stopped drowning it out with imagined disasters. He cut the rice a full day earlier than he might have chosen in a calmer state of mind. A decision that turned out, in the end, to be exactly right, though he could never afterwards say for certain whether the rest had sharpened his judgment, or simply allowed the judgment that was already there to finally be heard. Whatever uncertain thing you may be carrying tonight, whatever storm still 2 days off, whatever decision not yet due, let your mind set down the rehearsal for now. The outcome, whatever it turns out to be, is not waiting on your imagination to finish auditioning every possible disaster first, and it will not arrive any better prepared for having been imagined a dozen extra times before sleep. No matter how thorough or how careful that imagining is felt, breathe in and feel the weight of tomorrow's uncertainty loosen its grip on tonight, the way those shoulders finally loosened somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn. the tension leaving his body the way water finally leaves a wrung cloth. Breathe out and let there be. For these few hours, only this room, this breath, this one actual moment, undisturbed by futures that have not yet arrived and may never arrive at all in the shape you fear. In the shape your tired mind has been so busy constructing. Somewhere close to sleep, an old ache waits its turn, quieter than worry, the particular tiredness of noticing you have been fighting yourself again, and feeling, on top of that fight, ashamed of having fought at all, as though the fighting itself were a fresh failure, layered onto whatever the original struggle happened to be. One more thing to carry when the night was already heavy enough without it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the first mistake at all, but from the second one built directly on top of it. The mind circling back, not to correct anything, but simply to punish itself again for having needed correcting in the first place. It is a strange, self-feeding kind of tiredness, one that produces nothing, resolves nothing, and yet somehow feels, in the moment, like the responsible thing to keep doing. Like vigilance, rather than the quiet cruelty it actually is. You may know this loop, the one that begins with an ordinary lapse, a sharp word, to a moment of impatience, a small failure of the kind every person commits daily, and does not end there, but continues into a second round of judgment aimed squarely at the failure itself. And then, if the mind is tired enough, a third round aimed at how harshly you have been judging yourself for the first two. And sometimes, on the very hardest nights, the fourth round questioning whether you have any right to feel tired at all after such a small thing. Each layer feels, in the moment, like accountability. Together, they are simply exhaustion, wearing several disguises at once, each one convincing enough on its own to keep the whole tower standing. The Buddha taught that the arrow of pain is often followed by a second arrow of resistance, but rarely named is the quieter third arrow, the one that appears when we notice we have shot the second arrow at all, and punish ourselves for that too. A recursive wound that can, left unchecked, continue indefinitely, each layer justifying the next until the original moment is entirely buried beneath the weight of everything added on top of it. Long ago, in a small house at the edge of a rice farming village, a mother named Anne discovered just how many arrows a single evening could hold. The house had settled into its late evening stillness, the low crackle of the cooking fire dying down to embers in the kitchen, the steady chirp of crickets rising from the garden outside the shuttered window, and somewhere down the hall, the soft, even breathing of her young son, he finally asleep after the long evening that had brought them both to tears, his small chest rising and falling in the unhurried rhythm of a child whose troubles, unlike his mother's, had already fully passed. It had started small. Anne had asked her son twice to put away his toys before dinner, and when he ignored her a third time, absorbed in his play, some quiet fortress he had built from wooden blocks that mattered enormously to him, and not at all to the rest of the house, something in her had simply snapped, her voice rising sharper than the moment called for, sharp enough that his small face had crumpled immediately, his lower lip trembling in the particular way that always undid her, sharp enough that she had seen, in the half-second after the words left her mouth, exactly how much larger her reaction was than his small offense. She had apologized within the minute, gathered him into her arms, explained that Mama was tired and hadn't meant to shout so loudly, and he had forgiven her the way young children forgive, completely and almost immediately, already reaching for his toys again by the time she finished speaking, the whole incident already folding itself into the ordinary texture of an ordinary evening in his young mind, the tears drying as quickly as they had come. But Anne had not forgiven herself nearly so quickly, and long after he had fallen asleep, she lay awake, replaying the sharpness of her own voice, turning it over and over in the dark, like a stone she could not quite set down. Her own mother, Grandmother Lone, who lived with them and had heard the whole exchange from the next room. I found Anne still awake near midnight, sitting up in bed with her knees drawn to her chest, the small oil lamp beside her bed casting long shadows across the wall, the wax pooling low and uneven from having burned so long past its usual hour. "You're still on this," Lone said, settling onto the edge of the bed without needing an invitation, her old joints protesting faintly as she lowered herself down. "I shouldn't have shouted like that," Anne said, her voice tight. "He's 5 years old. He forgot to put away some toys. That's not a reason to raise my voice the way I did." "No," Lone agreed. "It probably wasn't. You were tired, and it came out sharper than you meant it to. That happens to every mother who has ever lived, more times than any of us like to admit. I know that. I've told myself that a dozen times tonight. And every time I tell myself that, some other part of me starts in on how I shouldn't need to tell myself that at all. That a patient mother wouldn't have snapped in the first place. That I'm somehow failing him by even needing forgiveness for something this small in the first place. And by the time that thought finishes, I've forgotten I was ever supposed to be resting." Lone was quiet a moment, watching her daughter's tired face in the dim light, the lamp flickering slightly, with a draft from somewhere. "So first you were angry at him, then angry at yourself for being angry at him, and now, angrier still, at yourself for being angry at yourself." Anne gave a short, humorless laugh, the first sound close to laughter she had made all evening. "When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous." "It is a little ridiculous," Lone said, not unkindly, her hand finding Anne's where it rested on the blanket. "Though I did the exact same thing more nights than I can count. When you were his age, sitting up half the night, convinced that one sharp word had somehow undone years of patience. The shouting is one wound. Punishing yourself for shouting is a second wound, entirely separate. And punishing yourself for punishing yourself, that's a third. And by then you're so far from the original moment that you've forgotten it was ever about him at all. Then, what am I supposed to do? Just let myself shout at him and feel nothing about it?" Anne's voice carried a note of genuine confusion now, not defensiveness, her tired eyes searching her mother's face for something more useful than the easy reassurance she half expected. "No," Lone said. "Feel the first thing honestly. You were short with him, and that's worth noticing, worth apologizing for, which you already did, gracefully, within the minute, the way I watched you do it through the wall. But once you've noticed it and made it right, the noticing is finished. Everything after that is just you finding new reasons to keep the wound open, as though closing it too quickly would mean you didn't take it seriously enough. as though the length of your suffering were somehow proof of the depth of your love for him. Once you've noticed it and made it right, the noticing is finished. And sat with that, the words settling into her like water, finding its way into dry soil. Slow and unhurried, the crickets still steady outside the window, indifferent to the whole conversation happening inside. The same steady chirp they had kept up all evening, regardless of what unfolded in the house behind the shutters. She thought of her son's face, crumpled for a moment, and then, minutes later, entirely at peace, already forgiven and forgotten on his end. Sleeping now in the next room without a single trace of the tension that had passed between them. He had needed exactly one round of feeling, one apology, one embrace, and then he had simply moved on, unburdened by any of the layers she had spent the last several hours adding on her own. Layer after layer, each one convincing her it was the necessary one, and considered this a while longer, watching the shadows the lamp threw against the far wall, shapes that shifted slightly with each small draft finding its way through the shutters. "It's strange," she finally said. "I can forgive him instantly for almost anything. It's only myself I keep putting on trial." "That's most mothers," Lone said. "We learn to extend to our children a patience we somehow never think to extend to ourselves, as though we were made of sterner material, as though our own hearts didn't need the same gentleness we hand out so freely to theirs." "He forgave me in about 30 seconds, Anne said quietly, almost to herself, the realization landing with a weight she hadn't expected. "Children usually do," Lone said. "They feel the thing, and then they're finished feeling it. It's grown people who build houses for their feelings and move in permanently, hanging pictures on the walls, settling in for the long term, as though the feeling itself needed a place to live rather than simply a moment to pass through." What was Anne actually doing in those hours of self-directed judgment, stacked on judgment, not holding herself accountable, though it had felt that way with each new layer added in the dark? She was mistaking repetition for depth, as though feeling bad about a mistake 3 times over made the accountability more real than feeling it once, honestly, and then setting it down, as though suffering longer was somehow proof of caring more, as though love for a child could be measured by the number of hours spent awake regretting a single sharp word. That is the particular trap of the third arrow, that it disguises itself as conscience, as the mark of someone who takes their own failures seriously, when in truth it is simply suffering, multiplying itself for no purpose beyond its own continuation. A fire that keeps itself burning by mistaking its own smoke for evidence of something still worth tending, when in fact, the smoke is only proof that the fire has long since stopped serving anyone. Grown people build houses for their feelings and move in permanently. Anne did not sleep easily that night, not entirely, the last traces of the evening's tension still lingering somewhere in her chest. A low hum beneath the surface that would not quite dissolve, though it had already grown fainter than it had been an hour earlier. But somewhere in the hour after her mother finally left the room, the oil lamp finally extinguished and the house settling into full darkness, she noticed the layers beginning to separate themselves. The original moment with her son settling into something small and finished, already forgiven twice over, once by him and once, more slowly, by herself, and the endless self-judgment that had been stacked on top of it beginning, slowly, to lose its grip, one layer at a time. The way frost finally releases a window pane once the sun has had long enough to work on it. Whatever mistake you may be carrying tonight, however small or however sharp, let yourself feel it, honestly, once, and then let the noticing be finished. You do not need a second round of judgment to prove the first one mattered. You do not need a third round to prove the second one was warranted. And you certainly do not need a fourth round questioning whether you have any right to finally rest. Whether resting itself might somehow be another failure waiting to be discovered. Breathe in, and notice how many layers you may have quietly stacked onto something that started small. Layer after layer, each one feeling necessary at the time it was added. Each one certain it was the last one needed before rest could finally come. Breathe out, and let all but the first honest one go. The way and finally let hers go somewhere in the deepest hour of that long night. Her mother's words settling slowly into the quiet after the lamp had gone dark. Somewhere past this last small unburdening, there is only one thing left to find tonight. Not a story this time, not a teaching, but simply the quiet at the very bottom of all this letting go. The place where even the layers themselves finally have nothing left to add. Where nothing further needs to be understood, corrected, or forgiven. Only felt and then released. There is nothing left tonight to carry into a story. No new teacher, no new season, no new name to learn. Only this room, and you inside it, and a hand somewhere on the blanket that has, by now, stopped checking whether anything still hurts. The night has grown very quiet around you, the kind of quiet that does not need filling, the kind that simply is. You have been awake a long time with all of this. The bruise from the very beginning of tonight, the one you pressed to see if it still ached, has been sitting quietly this whole while, asked about again and again, held up to the light more times than it ever needed. It does not need checking anymore. It never really did. It has been telling you the same thing for hours now, patiently, without any urgency at all, and the only thing left to do is finally hear it. Let your hand rest now, wherever it is lying, palm open, fingers loose, not reaching for anything, not holding anything, not proving anything to anyone, least of all to yourself. This is the only shape it needs to take tonight. Not a fist, not a grip, only open, the way it was always meant to be before the night began, asking so much of it. Somewhere behind you, all the small rooms of this evening are settling into stillness, one by one, the way a house settles once every lamp has finally been put out. The stonecutter's back, no longer bracing. The boatwoman's arms, no longer rowing. The old sentence, no longer repeating itself. The ruined cloth, folded and closed. The tide line, empty now. The watching finally finished. The envy, passed like weather through a valley that remains unchanged. The grief, whatever shape it actually took tonight, however it needed to be felt. The mountain and its quiet story, settled. The storm, arriving on its own schedule, indifferent and unhurried. The layers, set down one after another, until nothing was left standing but the one true thing underneath them all. None of it needs revisiting again tonight. It has already been felt, and felt once, honestly, is enough. You do not have to hold on to any of it a moment longer than it takes to let it go. Feel your breath now, without changing it, without deepening it, without doing anything to it at all. It has been arriving on its own the entire time, long before you thought to notice it, and it will keep arriving long after you stop noticing it again, all through the night, asking nothing of you in return. In and out. That is the whole of it. Nothing more complicated than that has ever been required of you tonight. There is a weight in your body that has been asking, for longer than you can probably remember, to simply be set down, not fixed, not understood, not explained, only set down. Let it go now, the way a hand finally opens after holding something for far too long, not because the holding was wrong, but because the hand was only ever meant to hold for a while. Everything held too long grows heavy. Everything set down grows light again. Eventually, on its own, the bruise does not need pressing again. The old sentence does not need repeating again. The mistake does not need reopening again. The waiting does not need watching again. The envy does not need feeding again. The grief does not need measuring again. The aloneness does not need explaining again. The storm does not need imagining again. The second judgment does not need adding again. Whatever is left, whatever quiet thing you are still holding, does not need naming again either. Let it simply be here, unnamed, unexamined, and let that be enough. There is only this: a body, heavy and warm against whatever it is resting on. A breath, arriving and leaving on its own. A darkness, soft rather than empty. A hand, open. A night, holding you the way it has held every tired body that has ever finally allowed itself to stop. Let the room hold you now. Let the night hold you. Let go of the last small effort of holding on at all, and rest. Simply rest, with nothing further to carry, and nothing further to become. Tonight, nothing further to prove, nothing further to fix. Only this breath, and the one after it, and the one after that, quietly continuing on their own, long after you have finally, fully let go. The body knows how to do this, even when the mind forgets. It has done it every night of your life. This quiet surrender into stillness. This letting the weight of the day finally settle into whatever is holding you up right now. Trust it tonight. Trust the part of you that has always known how to rest. Even on the nights the mind insisted there was still one more thing to hold on to. One more worry to finish. One more layer to add. One more version of tomorrow to rehearse before it would finally allow you to close your eyes. There is a stillness underneath all the moving thoughts of this evening, underneath the stories and the reflections and the questions asked and answered. A stillness that was there before any of it began and will still be there after all of it has finally quieted. Patient and unmoving beneath every layer of the night's activity. You do not have to reach for that stillness. You are already resting inside it, the way a stone rests at the bottom of a river, undisturbed by whatever passes above it, unmoved by the current, untroubled by the surface. Let your shoulders sink a little further into whatever they are resting against. Let your jaw soften, the last small tension of the day finally releasing from somewhere behind your teeth. a tension you may have carried since morning without ever quite noticing it was there. Let your eyes, if they are not already closed, grow heavy, the way eyes grow heavy at the true end of a long day, unforced, unhurried, simply following the body's own quiet permission. Nothing tonight requires your effort any longer. Not one more thought needs finishing. Not one more feeling needs sorting through. Not one more question needs an answer before you are allowed to rest. Whatever remains unresolved tonight is allowed to remain exactly that, unresolved, and still you are allowed to sleep, fully, completely, without waiting for permission that was never actually required in the first place. The dark outside this room continues on, indifferent and patient, the way it always has, the way it always will, long before you were here and long after you are gone from this particular night. There is something steadying in that, something that asks nothing of you, some quiet company in simply being one more small, tired body inside a much larger darkness that has held countless others exactly like you, night after night, without ever once growing tired of the holding, without ever once asking anything back in return. Feel the weight of your own body now, fully, without resisting it, without wishing it were lighter or different or somewhere else. This weight, right here, right now, is simply what a tired body feels like at the end of a long day, and there is nothing wrong with it, nothing to fix about it, nothing to understand about it beyond this simple fact of its presence. This simple, honest fact that a body has worked hard and is finally, at long last, allowed to stop, breathe in, slowly, and let the breath fill whatever space it naturally wants to fill. No more, no less. Breathe out, slowly, and let go of whatever small thing still wants holding. One more time, gently, without force, the way a leaf finally lets go of a branch once autumn has done its quiet work. There is nothing more to understand tonight. There is nothing more to become. There is only this room, this breath, this body, this darkness, holding you exactly the way you need to be held right now, without asking anything else of you at all. Let the last of the evening's thoughts drift by without following any of them. They will still be there tomorrow if they matter, and if they don't, they will have already dissolved on their own by morning, the way most things do once we finally stop holding them so tightly through the night. Rest now. Simply rest. The hand is open. The breath is arriving on its own. The night is holding you, and it will keep holding you, all the way through until morning, whether you notice it or not, whether you thank it or not, whether you do anything at all beyond simply allowing yourself, finally, completely, to let go. There may still be a faint hum somewhere in your chest, the last small echo of everything this night has held, and that is allowed to stay too, unattended, unexamined. Simply present the way a sound continues to hang in a room for a moment after the source of it has gone quiet. You do not have to chase it away. You do not have to understand where it came from tonight. It will fade on its own, the way sound always eventually fades, leaving only the quiet that was underneath it the whole time. Feel the mattress or the pillow or whatever is holding your body right now, solid and unmoving beneath you, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply there, the way it has been there every night, the way it will be there again tomorrow night. patient in a manner nothing else in your day has needed to be. If a thought arrives, let it arrive, and let it pass just as easily as it came, without following it down whatever path it wants to lead you. You are not required to solve anything tonight. You are not required to plan anything tonight. You are not required to remember anything tonight. Tonight asks only one thing of you, and it is the easiest thing anyone has ever asked of you, simply to rest. The room around you holds its own quiet now, undisturbed, unhurried, exactly as it should be at this hour. Whatever light remains outside your window, whatever small sounds drift in from beyond these walls, none of it requires anything from you. You can simply let it all continue on its own, the way the whole world continues on its own while you sleep, the way it always has, long before tonight and long after. Your breath continues, steady beneath everything else, the one constant that has never once asked you to manage it, never once needed your permission to keep arriving. In and out. Simple, patient, endlessly forgiving of every distracted moment, every held breath, every sigh that has passed through your chest tonight without your even noticing. Let your whole body grow heavier now, sinking further into whatever is beneath you. The way a stone settles more fully into soft earth, the longer it rests there undisturbed. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is nothing else you need to hold. There is only this moment, and this one, and this one, each arriving and passing exactly as gently as the last. Somewhere in this stillness, sleep is already beginning to find you, quietly, without announcing itself, the way it always arrives, not as a decision you make, but as a surrender you finally allow. Let it come. Let it come exactly the way it wants to come, without needing to be earned, without needing to be chased, without needing anything further from you at all. The night does not measure how well you have rested. It simply holds you, the way it has held every tired person who has ever finally allowed themselves to stop reaching for anything at all, the way it will hold you again tomorrow, and the night after that, patient, beyond counting, asking nothing in return. Let your fingers uncurl a little further, if they have not already. Let your breath find whatever depth it wants to find on its own, without your guidance, without your effort. There is nothing left for you to do tonight except this simple, unremarkable, endlessly repeated act of allowing yourself to be exactly as tired as you actually are, and letting that tiredness finally be enough to carry you the rest of the way. Somewhere behind you now, a hand has finally opened. The bruise it once pressed, over and over, checking whether the ache was still there, has been let go of at last, not healed by force, but simply no longer needing to be found. Tonight carried you through a stonecutter's quarry and a boatwoman's river, a calligraphy hall and a weaving house, a mountain shrine and a fishing village, a monastery courtyard and a rice field waiting on a storm, each one holding the same quiet teaching in a different shape, that the first pain is rarely the one that keeps us awake, and that most of what we carry, we place there ourselves, one small addition at a time. You do not have to remember any of it by name. You do not have to carry a single detail forward into tomorrow. What matters was never the stonecutter or the boatwoman, or the mother sitting up past midnight with her own tired heart. What matters is only this. Whatever hurt you tonight, it was allowed to simply hurt. Once. Honestly. Without a second arrow added on top of it. And whatever you added anyway. Out of habit. Out of fear. Out of old patterns, older than tonight. That too has been allowed to finally set itself down. Let yourself sink further now. Into the mattress. Into the dark. Into the last unguarded minutes before sleep finally takes you all the way under. I have sat with these stories longer than I can easily explain. And the ones that return to me most are never the dramatic ones. They are the small, quiet moments where someone simply stopped fighting what had already happened. I hope tonight gave you one of your own to carry, however small, however quietly it arrived. Tomorrow will bring its own ordinary weight, its own small frustrations, its own moments worth feeling once and then releasing. You do not have to solve any of it tonight. You do not have to prepare for any of it either. Tomorrow can wait until it actually arrives. If tonight helped even slightly, there is no need to do anything more than close your eyes and let the rest happen on its own. Rest now. The hand is open. The night is patient. And somewhere in the quiet beneath all of it, you were never actually carrying as much as you believed.